Let me ask you something. What truly decides victory in a medieval battle? Is it numbers? Courage? The unstoppable charge of heavy cavalry? All of that meant nothing when faced something far deadlier. Superior strategy, cold precision, and ruthless determination. This is the story of the Mongol Storm, when just 20,000 warriors crushed 100,000 Europe's greatest knights in only 3 days. Spring 1241. Across the wind-swept plains of Eastern Europe, an army unlike anything the Christian world had encountered was carving a path of destruction toward the heart of medieval civilization. Within weeks, two of the largest military forces Europe had ever assembled would cease to exist, annihilated by an enemy using tactics that seemed to defy the very laws of warfare itself. This isn't just another medieval battle story. What happened in April that year would shatter every assumption Europeans held about combat, honor, and military supremacy. By the time the smoke cleared, the flower of European chivalry lay scattered across blood-soaked battlefields, and the medieval world would never be the same. If you're into medieval history, the rise of empires, and the kind of battles that flip the balance of power overnight, hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and what time it is down below. It's funny to imagine you might be having morning coffee while I'm recording late at night. Anyway, get comfortable, relax, and let's start. What you're about to hear is one of the most staggering military victories in human history. The Storm Gathering. To understand the catastrophe that was about to unfold, we need to grasp what Europe was truly facing. These weren't the disorganized barbarian raiders that medieval chroniclers would desperately describe after their defeat. The Mongol Empire of 1241 was the most sophisticated war machine humanity had yet produced. Under the leadership of Ogedei Khan, Genghis Khan's chosen successor, the empire had exploded to twice the size of Rome at its zenith. They had conquered China's fortified cities, crushed the Islamic world's most powerful kingdoms, and perfected military tactics on battlefields spanning from Korea to Persia. Now, with methodical precision, they turned their attention westward. The invasion force that crossed into Europe was commanded by Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, with the legendary general Subutai providing the strategic genius. Subutai deserves special mention here. At age 60, he had already conquered more territory than Alexander the Great. He had personally commanded campaigns across 3 continents and never lost a major engagement. This wasn't some young warlord seeking glory. This was a master craftsman applying 6 decades of military expertise. Every Mongol warrior represented a lifetime of preparation. From the age of 3, children learned to ride. By 5, they were shooting arrows from horseback. By adulthood, they could accurately hit targets at full gallop, switch between multiple horses without dismounting, and survive for weeks on minimal rations, mare's milk, dried meat, and whatever they could forage or plunder. Their primary weapon, the composite bow, was a technological marvel. Constructed from layers of horn, wood, and sinew, it could launch arrows accurately to 350 meters, nearly double the range of European crossbows. Each warrior carried 60 arrows, with supply horses bearing hundreds more. The mathematics were terrifying. 20,000 warriors times 60 arrows equals 1.2 million projectiles before resupply. But technology alone doesn't win wars. The Mongols possessed something far more dangerous, a revolutionary approach to warfare itself. While European armies were rigid hierarchies where individual knights sought personal glory, Mongol forces operated as fluid, coordinated systems. They communicated across vast distances using smoke signals, flags, and drums. They employed extensive spy networks, often disguised as merchants that provided detailed intelligence months before armies clashed. They practiced coordinated maneuvers that would seem advanced even by modern standards. Most critically, they had perfected the art of psychological warfare. They understood that breaking an enemy's will to fight was often more valuable than breaking their bodies. Terror was a weapon, and they wielded it with surgical precision. Europe's response. Duke Henry's desperate gamble. As Mongol armies devastated Kiev in 1240 and swept through the Russian principalities, panic spread westward like wildfire. By early 1241, it was clear that the invasion would split into multiple prongs. One massive force would strike Hungary, while smaller detachments would neutralize Poland and prevent any unified European actions. Duke Henry II of Silesia, called the Pious for his devotion to the Church, understood the stakes with chilling clarity. A seasoned commander and veteran of multiple campaigns, Henry was no fool. The desperate messages arriving from the east painted a picture of supernatural destruction, entire cities reduced to ash in days, armies obliterated in hours, populations massacred down to the last child. Henry sent urgent calls across Poland, Moravia, and the German states. The response was unprecedented. The Knights Templar, those legendary warrior monks forged in the Crusades' fires, rode north. The Teutonic Knights, fresh from their Baltic campaigns, marched south with their elite heavy cavalry. Polish nobles put aside bitter feuds. Duke Mieszko II of Opole brought his entire retinue. Moravian infantry joined. Even gold miners from Silesia's rich deposits, men who'd never held swords, volunteered to defend Christendom. The army that assembled represented the concentrated military might of Eastern European Christianity. Modern historians estimated it was one of the largest forces the medieval period had seen. They possessed heavier armor than any other military on Earth, weapons forged from the finest steel, and centuries of martial tradition. They had the Pope's blessing and genuinely believed God would shield them. What they didn't have was any conception of what they were about to face. Day 1. April 7, 1241. The Revelation. The European army advanced from Legnica in traditional formation, a magnificent, terrifying display of martial power. At the center rode the heavy cavalry, thousands of knights in chainmail and early plate armor, mounted on massive destriers bred for strength rather than speed. Each knight's equipment cost more than a village produced in a year. On the flanks marched infantry, Polish spearmen, Moravian crossbowmen, Silesian miners with improvised weapons. Priests moved through the ranks blessing swords and offering absolution. Banners streamed in the wind. The Black Cross of the Teutonic Order, the Red Cross of the Templars, Poland's White Eagle. Then, on the horizon, dust appeared. Different dust, lighter, faster, wrong somehow. The first Mongol riders materialized like phantoms. Light cavalry on small, shaggy horses that looked almost comical compared to European war horses. Some knights actually laughed. These were the terrifying Mongols? These small men on ponies? That laughter died quickly. The Mongol riders advanced to just beyond European weapon range, then released their first volley. Arrows arced high into the sky, a sound like distant thunder. Before the European crossbowmen could even crank their weapons, the Mongols had wheeled their horses and vanished, only to reappear from a different angle moments later. For hours this continued. Wave after wave of horse archers harassed European lines, always staying just beyond retaliation range. They weren't trying to win yet. They were probing, testing, gathering the final intelligence that would determine their assault plan. Every response the Europeans made was carefully noted. Which commanders were aggressive? Which cautious? Where were the gaps in discipline? The psychological toll was devastating. European knights trained for the glorious charge, the clash of steel, honorable single combat. Instead, they stood like targets while enemies they couldn't reach slowly bled them. Horses screamed as arrows found gaps in their armor. Men cursed as shafts penetrated mail at the joints. The infantry, with lighter protection, suffered even worse. Duke Henry ordered his crossbowmen to respond, but it was futile. By the time a crossbow was cranked for a single shot, the Mongols were already out of range. The Templars requested permission to charge. Henry refused. He recognized the trap. But holding formation while being systematically shot to pieces was destroying morale faster than arrows destroyed bodies. By sunset, hundreds lay dead or wounded. The Mongols had lost perhaps a dozen men. That night, the psychological warfare intensified. Mongol drummers beat their war drums ceaselessly, deep, rhythmic, relentless. No European slept. The sound was everywhere, a constant reminder. We're out there, we're waiting, we're coming. Day 2, April 8, 1241. The Trap Springs. Dawn broke blood red. Duke Henry's camp was exhausted, nerves frayed. Arguments erupted between Polish nobles and Templar commanders. The Teutonic Knights demanded an immediate charge. Duke Mieszko of Opole threatened to withdraw if they continued standing like cattle for slaughter. Henry knew he had to act. When Mongol riders appeared again using the same harassment tactics, he made a calculated decision. Send Duke Mieszko with 2,000 knights in a partial charge, not the entire force, just enough to drive off the horse archers, and perhaps capture some for interrogation. The ground shook as Poland's finest thundered forward. Lances lowered, shields raised. They were an avalanche of steel and fury. The Mongol light cavalry, apparently panicked, turned and fled. The Europeans pursued, blood singing with the promise of revenge. "We have them!" Mieszko shouted. "Press forward! Glory to Christ!" The pursuit stretched for miles. European horses, carrying armored men, began to tire. But the Mongols always remained just out of reach, occasionally turning to fire a few arrows, spurring the knights to greater effort. Some Polish nobles began to suspect a trap, but Mieszko, consumed with battle fury, pushed onward. It was the feigned retreat, the Mongols' signature tactic, perfected over decades of warfare across Asia. Here's a detail the scripts miss. The Mongols had practiced this specific maneuver so extensively that they could execute it with different units simultaneously, creating multiple false retreat corridors that would converge at predetermined kill zones. European commanders had no framework for understanding such sophisticated coordination. As the Polish cavalry became strung out over miles and their formation completely shattered, the trap closed with mechanical precision. Mongol heavy cavalry? Yes, the Mongols had heavy cavalry too, something the Europeans hadn't anticipated. Emerged from concealed positions in the rolling terrain. Light cavalry units that had been circling unseen, now closed from all sides. Duke Mieszko's force found itself surrounded, cut off from the main army, isolated on open ground where European advantages evaporated. What followed wasn't battle, it was systematic execution. The Mongols didn't engage in heroic close combat. They circled the trapped Europeans like wolves around sheep, pouring arrows into the mass of men and horses. When knights tried to break out, they were driven back by coordinated charges. When they stood still, they were shot to pieces. Duke Mieszko fought valiantly. Accounts say he personally killed over a dozen Mongols before 5 arrows brought him down. His bodyguards made a last stand around his fallen body, but they were overwhelmed in minutes. Of 2,000 knights who charged that morning, fewer than 200 returned. The survivors were traumatized. They spoke of warriors who communicated without words, who moved with inhuman coordination, who killed without mercy or honor. One knight, his armor pierced by 7 arrows, died repeating, "They are not men, not men." That night, the Mongols sent a message to Henry's camp. Duke Mieszko's head preserved in salt, with a note in broken Latin. "Tomorrow, you." Day 3. April 9, 1241. Legnica falls. Henry's war council that morning was barely controlled chaos. He'd lost big chunk of his army. Moravian infantry teetered on the edge of desertion. Several Polish nobles had already fled during the night. But Henry understood that retreat was suicide. The Mongols would run them down on open plains. The only option was to stand and fight. He chose his ground carefully. A field near the village of Legnica, with a slight rise for his archers and a stream on one flank to prevent encirclement. He arranged forces defensively. Templars and Teutonic Knights forming an unbreakable center, Polish cavalry on the right wing, remaining infantry on the left. As morning mist cleared, the Mongols appeared. But something was different. They were positioning strange devices, large pots or cauldrons mounted on wheeled frames. The Europeans watched, puzzled. Some sort of ritual equipment? Then the battle began, and the true horror of Mongol innovation was revealed. The devices were Chinese smoke generators, an early application of gunpowder technology the Mongols had acquired during their conquest of northern China. Here's a fascinating detail. These weren't explosive weapons, but psychological ones. The mixture likely included sulfur, saltpeter, and arsenic compounds that created thick, choking clouds while also producing toxic fumes that caused confusion and nausea. The Mongols ignited the devices. Within minutes, massive clouds of gray smoke rolled across the battlefield. The carefully organized European formation dissolved into chaos. Men couldn't see beyond a few feet. Commands were lost in coughing and confusion. Banners, the medieval communication system, vanished in the haze. Knights stumbled into their own infantry. Horses, panicked by the acrid smoke, became uncontrollable. Then came the masterstroke of psychological warfare. From within the smoke came voices shouting in Polish, "Uciekajcie! Straceni!" which means run, all is lost. Polish soldiers, unable to see through the smoke and hearing what sounded like their own commanders ordering retreat, began to run. Panic spread like plague. The Mongols had captured Polish prisoners days earlier and forced them to learn this single phrase. Now, Mongol warriors who'd memorized the sound shouted these words across the battlefield. The confusion was total. Units collided with each other. The left-wing infantry broke first, streaming away in terror, exposing the center. The Mongols attacked with perfect coordination. How they maintained unit cohesion in the smoke remains partially mysterious, but recent scholarship suggests they used different drum frequencies, low tones for advance, high for wheel, mid-range for loose, that could penetrate the chaos and be felt as much as heard by warriors trained from childhood to recognize them. Light cavalry struck from the flanks, pouring arrows into the confused masses. Heavy cavalry smashed into broken units, shattering them completely. The Templars fought with desperate courage. Surrounded, outnumbered, unable to see enemies until they were upon them, they formed a defensive circle and fought to the last man. Their Grand Master, Popo von Ostana, was found after the battle with 23 arrows in his body, his sword broken, surrounded by Mongol dead. Duke Henry, seeing his army disintegrating, made a final, fatal decision. He rode forward with his personal banner, trying to create a rallying point. For a moment, it worked. Polish knights began converging on his position. Then a Mongol arrow, fired by an unknown archer, struck him in the armpit where his armor plates joined. He swayed but stayed mounted, still trying to rally his men. His bodyguards closed around him, attempting to get him off the battlefield. But the Mongols had marked him as the commander. They concentrated fire on this small group. Henry's guards died one by one. Finally, weakened by blood loss, Henry fell from his horse. Seeing their duke fall, the last organized resistance collapsed. It became a rout, then a slaughter. Henry, still alive but mortally wounded, was captured. Following their tradition of honoring brave enemies, the Mongol commanders offered him a quick death. He refused, saying he would die as he had lived, as a Christian knight. They obliged. His head was cut off and mounted on a spear, later paraded around Legnica as proof of victory. By noon it was over. Following their custom, the Mongols cut off the right ear of each slain enemy to count the dead. They filled 9 large leather sacks. Virtually the entire nobility of Silesia had been eliminated. Mongol casualties? Fewer than 700. Days later, Henry's mother, Duchess Hedwig, was permitted to search the battlefield for her son's body. Among thousands of mutilated corpses, she could identify him only by a genetic peculiarity. He had been born with 6 toes on his left foot. 2 days later, April 11th, 1241. The Battle of Mohi. While news of Legnica's catastrophe was still spreading, an even larger disaster was unfolding 300 miles to the south in Hungary. King Bela IV of Hungary had assembled what may have been the largest army in medieval European history, between 60,000 and 100,000 warriors. This was the combined strength of Hungary, reinforced by contingents from Croatia, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire. It included battle-hardened crusaders who'd survived campaigns in the Holy Land, the finest knights from across Central Europe, and thousands of experienced infantry. They had taken position along the Saho River near the town of Mohi, confident that their overwhelming numerical superiority would crush any Mongol force that dared face them in open battle. They outnumbered the approaching Mongol army by at least 3 to 1, potentially 5 to 1. What they didn't know was that they were facing Subutai himself, commanding the main invasion force. And Subutai had been studying European tactics for over a year, using intelligence gathered from captured prisoners, deserters, and his extensive spy network. The battle began before dawn on April 11th. While the Hungarian army slept, believing themselves secure behind the river, Mongol engineers had been working through the night at multiple crossing points. Here's a forgotten fact. The Mongols had Chinese engineers who constructed portable pontoon bridges, technology completely unknown in Europe at the time. These bridges could be assembled in darkness and dismantled rapidly, allowing forces to cross rivers at unexpected locations. The main Hungarian force had concentrated its attention on a single stone bridge crossing the Savoie. When Mongol forces appeared there at dawn, beginning to cross in what seemed like a standard frontal assault, Hungarian commanders saw exactly what they expected: an enemy foolishly attacking across a choke point where they could be slaughtered. King Bela IV ordered his forces forward to defend the bridge. For several hours, the battle at the bridge was exactly what European military doctrine predicted, a grinding meat grinder where superior Hungarian numbers should have overwhelmed the attackers. Hungarians didn't realize that this was a diversion. While their attention focused on the bridge, other Mongol forces had crossed the river upstream and downstream on their portable bridges. By mid-morning, these forces had completed a massive encirclement. The Hungarian army, which believed it was winning a defensive battle, suddenly found itself surrounded on three sides, with the river at their backs. Subutais' brilliance became evident in what happened next. Rather than immediately closing the trap completely, he deliberately left one apparent escape route open, a gap in the encirclement leading away from the river. This wasn't mercy, it was calculated butchery. Human psychology dictates that a completely surrounded army fights with desperate ferocity. But an army that sees an escape route will take it. When the Hungarian forces realized they were surrounded, panic spread through the ranks. They began streaming toward the apparent gap, abandoning formation and discipline. The gap was a killing corridor. As Hungarian forces poured through in desperate flight, Mongol cavalry positioned on both sides unleashed continuous arrow volleys at point-blank range into the packed, fleeing mass. It was like shooting fish in a barrel, except the barrel was miles long and the fish were Europe's finest knights. The slaughter continued for miles. Armored knights threw away their weapons and armor, trying to run faster. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Noblemen begged for mercy in languages their pursuers didn't understand or chose to ignore. Here's another overlooked detail. The Mongols employed what modern military theorists call reconnaissance in force during the pursuit. They didn't just kill everyone. They captured hundreds of prisoners and immediately interrogated them about fortifications deeper in Hungary. The pursuit was simultaneously a massacre and an intelligence-gathering operation. By sunset, the Hungarian army had ceased to exist. Estimates suggest between 40,000 and 60,000 dead. King Bela IV barely escaped with his life. His horse killed under him. An arrow through his jaw, physically dragged from the field by his personal guard as he tried to return to the fighting. The Mongol casualties numbered in the hundreds. The aftermath. Europe on its knees. In the span of just 2 days, April 9th and April 11th, 1241, the Mongol invasion had accomplished something that seemed impossible. Two of the largest European armies ever assembled had been systematically annihilated. Europe's finest warriors lay dead on battlefields in Poland and Hungary. Entire noble lineages had been extinguished. Kingdoms had lost their military leadership in single afternoons. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the military losses. For centuries, European feudal society had been built on a fundamental assumption: the armored knight was the supreme military force on earth. Noble blood, blessed by God, combined with superior equipment and martial training made knights invincible against common soldiers. The Mongols had shattered this illusion completely. They proved that peasant horse archers using tactics European military doctrine couldn't comprehend could slaughter the finest knights without breaking stride. They demonstrated that discipline, coordination, and strategic thinking trumped individual courage and expensive equipment. News spread across Europe with the speed of pure terror. In Paris, King Louis IX immediately began strengthening city walls and reorganizing military forces. In Rome, Pope Gregory IX called for a new crusade, not to the Holy Land, but to defend Europe itself from what chroniclers called the Devil's Horsemen. In Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, usually locked in conflicts with the Pope, suddenly found both sides willing to discuss peace in the face of this existential threat. European chroniclers, unable to accept that they'd been outfought, described the Mongols as demons, as supernatural beings, as divine punishment for Christianity's sins. The truth that they'd been defeated by superior tactics and military organization was too psychologically devastating to accept. And then, just as suddenly as the storm had come, it vanished. In December 1241, 8 months after Legnica and Mohi, Ogedei Khan died in Mongolia under circumstances that remain disputed. Some sources suggest excessive drinking during a hunting trip. Others hint at poison. But the cause of death mattered less than its consequence. By Mongol law, all members of the royal family had to return to the capital to elect a new great Khan. Batu Khan, frustrated but bound by tradition, withdrew his forces from Europe. The invasion force that had seemed unstoppable, that had terrified an entire continent, simply turned around and rode east. The Mongols would never penetrate this far into Europe again. Political struggles in the succession, the vast distances involved, and the eventual fragmentation of the Mongol Empire meant that the threat gradually receded. But Europe had been granted something it hadn't earned: time. Time to absorb the lessons written in blood across Polish and Hungarian plains. The Revolution. How 1241 changed warfare forever. The battles of Legnica and Mohi forced a complete rethinking of European military doctrine. Within a generation, fundamental changes began. Combined arms tactics became standard. No longer would armies rely solely on heavy cavalry charges. Infantry, archers, and cavalry learned to operate as coordinated units. Professional standing armies began replacing feudal levies. Knights called up for 40 days of annual service couldn't match warriors who trained year-round. Intelligence gathering became a priority. European kingdoms established their own spy networks and reconnaissance systems. Tactical flexibility replaced rigid honor codes. Commanders who clung to notions of honorable combat found themselves outmaneuvered by those willing to adapt. Early gunpowder weapons development accelerated. If the Mongols possessed such technology, Europe needed to catch up. Perhaps most significantly, the social implications rippled through feudal society. If common archers could destroy noble knights, what did that say about the divine right of nobility? The questions raised in 1241 would contribute to the gradual transformation of medieval society over the following centuries. When the Ottoman Turks, inheritors of many Mongol military traditions, threatened Europe 2 centuries later, they faced a completely different opponent. The Europe that stopped the Ottomans at Vienna in 1529 bore little resemblance to the Europe that had been devastated in 1241. It had evolved, adapted, and learned. The lesson was written in blood: adapt or die. Evolution through catastrophe. The legacy. Today, peaceful farmland covers the battlefields of Legnica and Mohi. Small monuments mark where thousands died. Tour groups occasionally visit. Not a lot of people have ever heard these names. But in military academies worldwide, these battles are still studied. Legnica and Mohi represent textbook examples of how superior tactics and coordination can overcome numerical superiority and technological advantages. They demonstrate the value of intelligence, psychological warfare, and operational flexibility. The Mongol campaigns of 1241 proved something that remains true today. Warfare evolves, and those who fail to evolve with it face extinction. No amount of courage, faith, or expensive equipment can substitute for strategic thinking and tactical innovation. Europe's most expensive armies, its finest knights, its religious warrior orders, its battle-hardened crusaders learned this lesson the hardest way possible. In just 2 days in April 1241, the medieval world order died on muddy battlefields in Eastern Europe. The hoofbeats have long since faded. The warriors are dust. But the lesson echoes through history. The future belongs not to the strongest or the bravest, but to those who can adapt, innovate, and think beyond the limitations of their own experience. In 1241, Europe failed that test. It survived only because fate intervened. But in surviving, it learned, and in learning, it ensured that it would never be caught so unprepared again. The Mongol Storm had passed, but the world it left behind would never be the same.